So I'll go on to introduce our two speakers. Today we have Dr. Linda Harris and Dr. Betty Feng. Dr. Linda Harris is a professor of cooperative extension in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis, and a collaborator in the Western Center for Food Safety. She oversees a research program on microbial food safety of fruits, vegetables, and tree nuts, and provides expertise on food safety microbiology throughout the food chain. Dr. Feng, after earning a doctoral degree in food science and finishing a 2-year postdoc program from UC Davis, Dr. Betty Feng joined Purdue University in 2018 as an assistant professor. Dr. Feng's research program uses a sociological approach to explore human factors that affect food safety behaviors. Her research identifies barriers to understanding food safety risks in kitchens and develops strategies that empower food handlers to make science-based decisions. She authored over 40 peer-reviewed publications and over 50 referred conference proceedings, and has delivered over 30 invited talks regionally, nationally, and internationally. Her current program has 6 graduate students and 12 undergraduate student researchers. She lives in West Lafayette, Indiana, with her husband, Andy, daughter, Evelyn, and their dog, Cinnamon, and their cat, Cream Puff. They enjoy cooking and love food and food science. So thank you, Dr. Harris, Dr. Feng. The floor is all yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to start with an acknowledgement slide, just to say that some of the work that I'm going to be presenting today has been generated over a long period of time with many different funding sources and a large number of collaborators. So the outline of our presentation today is we're gonna go back and forth between the two of us. I'm going to start to give you an overview of the microbiology of tree nuts and talk briefly on some outbreaks that have been associated with these soaked products. Then I'm going to transfer over to Betty, who is going to go over basically what consumers are communicating primarily on the internet on how to soak and what food safety concerns we might take from some of that communication. Then I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about what we know in the laboratory about the fate of foodborne pathogens during soaking of tree nuts. And we're going to finish up then with taking all of this information, and Betty's going to talk about how do we communicate safe practices when it comes to soaking nuts in a home. So we hope that by the end of this presentation today that you should be able to describe why people soak nuts, what hazards are associated with soaking tree nuts, what are the risks, and then what might be the risk reduction strategies that consumers can use to make these products safely at home. So I want to start with a little bit of basics on tree nuts. So tree nuts are dry, and so we call those low water activity or low moisture foods. And the water activity is generally less than 0.7, less than 7% moisture, and often much lower than that, 0.5 water activity or less than 5% moisture. And if you roast the product, it can go even lower than that. So very dry products, and that gives them a long shelf life. So as long as they're kept dry, microorganisms won't grow, there won't be spoilage due to microbial growth. And in fact, the spoilage happens mostly because nuts have high fat content, and the fats will oxidize over time, and that will lead to rancidity, and that's typically what ends the shelf life for a properly stored tree nut. Now, in order to prolong the shelf life of tree nuts, we often store them under cool conditions. And in fact, some storage recommendations for some types of nuts is to keep it in the refrigerator or in the freezer. And that again is to slow down that rancidity process and give a longer shelf life to these products. So tree nuts are grown out in nature. They're harvested in a wide variety of manners worldwide, but mostly in North America, a lot of mechanical harvesting and then mechanical handling post-harvest. And just like any other raw product, when you have a raw, untreated nut, foodborne pathogens can be present. But because you have this low moisture, pathogens don't grow in dry nuts and nut pastes. The other factor is that there's a wide range of things that consumers do with tree nuts when they take them home. So you can eat them out of hand, just out of the package. So we call that out of hand, and really there's no step that the consumer does to those nuts before consumption. But then nuts are also used in baking, where there would be a heat process, and some people like to roast their nuts at home, so that would also be some type of thermal process. So it really varies in amounts of product that were purchased raw and then might be treated afterwards in the home. So when we get into some numbers as to contamination of raw nuts, most of the data that we have is about Salmonella. Salmonella is a pathogen that's notorious for surviving in low moisture products. And so when you look at the prevalence of Salmonella across all nut types, and there's really large data sets available for at least half a dozen different types of nuts, you will see about a 1% positive rate in 100 gram samples. And just to give you a perspective of what 100 grams of nuts looks like, that's about 100 almonds. So in that bowl in the center there, the typical contamination rate, if the product was contaminated, would be 100 gram sample. The levels in the positive samples would range from 1 cell in 100 grams to 1 cell in 1,000 grams, which is 3 times what I've got here or 10 times what I've got here. So again, I think I messed up on what I was saying there. If you take 100 gram samples, multiple 100 gram samples, 1 out of 100 gram samples will be positive. That's a 1% prevalence rate. And of the one that's positive, only 1 cell might expect to be found. So low levels, but the risk is not zero. So the risk of contamination of raw nuts is small, but it's not zero. So if we look at what happens to pathogens that might happen to be on a raw nut, in this case, we looked at storage over a year, and we looked at storage at 3 different temperatures. The blue is for frozen, the red is for refrigerated, and the green is for room temperature. And you can see that when we store nuts at the conditions that extend their shelf life to reduce rancidity development, actually Salmonella survives very, very well under those conditions. And if we store at ambient temperature, we see a decline over time, and that decline is pretty slow. So 90% reduction, or a 1 log reduction, in about 50 to 150 days of storage at ambient temperature. So most of the surveys that have been published looking for prevalence have been done right after harvest. And so we expect that the prevalence by the time a consumer buys a product at retail would be lower. But the point here is that they are surviving well under normal conditions of storage. And this applies not only to salmonella, but also other pathogens that we've looked at. So this whole kind of story from my standpoint and from a research interest on soaked nuts was when I was on a trip. I was giving some presentations in Australia in 2015, and I always go to grocery stores when I am traveling, and I found this package of activated almonds, which at the time I was not familiar with that term. I wasn't familiar with what these were, and so I did some investigation, and it turns out that these were a soaked product and then dried. And of course, when you soak a product that is normally dry, you add water. Adding that water changes the dynamics for microorganisms because you've added back the main thing that has prevented microorganisms from growing. So I wanted to learn more about these types of activated or enhanced, fermented, sprouted. These are all terms that people use when they're talking about a soaked nut product. And so when I got back to the US and I started doing a little bit digging, I realized just how popular this process was, and for all sorts of different reasons. Now, at the same time, I started to ask the question, do these products cause outbreaks? Because we know that raw nuts have been implicated in outbreaks, and peanut butter and other types of nut paste have been related to outbreaks. And so when you look at the literature, there's definitely outbreaks that have been linked to soaked products starting in 2013. So this is a couple of years before I saw that product in Australia. And then this was in 2014, a chia seed powder where they had soaked the seeds and then dried them and then ground them and sold them as a dried product. And then some almond spreads, cashew almond spreads that were sprouted, so soaked and then blended, and then a couple of cheese products, including one outbreak that happened just last year. So definitely there are potential for outbreaks to occur with these products. So that's when I reached out to Betty. She was actually a postdoc in my lab at the time when we started to work on this. And Betty started to explore a little bit on what consumers are communicating with regards to food safety in making these products. So Betty, I'm going to switch over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. So yes, I was really excited to explore something like understanding how do consumers practice in their own home kitchen to soak their nuts. Because at that time, when we look at in the literature, there are not a lot of information about nut soaking. And also not to say, like, what do consumers do when they soak the nuts? So what we did was we conducted the content analysis of some popular recipes of nut soaking. And also we validated the findings on the popular recipes with some of our consumer surveys. So first, why did we start with conducting content analysis of popular recipes? Because we noticed that online recipes nowadays are really popular among various age groups, and consumers self-reported to follow the recipes and food handling practices presented. And based on a recent survey we conducted, consumers do source their recipes from social media, from YouTube, from Instagram, from Cookbook, and family and friends. So what we did was we conducted a search with Google search, and we used, at that time, it calls Alexa Analytics to assess how popular those blogs are. And based on the popularity, we selected 44 of those blog recipes. And then we searched for video recipes based on the popularity from YouTube. And we identified 41 that our view counts are more than 200 views at that time. So some of the tips of those during the search, it sounds easy, we just type things in, but actually we have to be very, it has to be more systematic. We want to make sure that all the searching keywords are consistent, and we have a list of exclusion criteria. When you search online, there are a lot of things that are not something you would expect to include in your search, and also avoid personalizing search results. As we know that a lot of those social media and also search engine are really good at personalizing what you see. So a lot of those has to be avoided. So let's look at the results. At first, as a researcher, I personally did not soak nuts. So I think a lot of our audience today, this could be a relatively newer concept. So why do consumers soak their tree nuts? So soaking a lot of the times are related to health benefits, including better digestion. They also claim that the nutrients will be much more easier to be absorbed after you soak it. And also even more exaggerated, a lot of the videos talking about all sorts of disease prevention and other health claims like weight loss, bone health. However, none of those claims had any like science-based evidence follow up those claims in those recipes. And also we noticed that when those popular recipes source nuts, they always talk about raw nuts. Either they would use strong words like you should always have raw nuts, or we would recommend you to use raw nuts. So almost half of the recipes specified sourcing raw nuts or unpasteurized almonds, and they recommended to source directly from the farm or purchasing products grown outside of the US. And sometimes they will say that why they they would like you to use raw nuts because they think like it's necessary for sprouting, and some said that to avoid decreasing enzyme activity. So we also noticed that when people mentioned that they soak the nuts, usually the soaking time was quite long. More than half would use this term called overnight. I think if we use overnight in a like consumer lay person's literature, it's quite common. However, overnight, when it comes to scientific research or when we want to elicit the conditions to conduct validation study, it will be very challenging because we wouldn't really know what does overnight mean, what specific hours they meant. And 3 of the recipes suggested soaking the almonds for at least 24 hours or even up to 3 days. And the soaking temperature was quite long too. So 37 out of 85 recipes provided soaking temperature, but only 29 of them indicated that what temperature it is. So those 29 indicated it's room temperature. And then only 27 out of 85 recipes provided a specific drying temperature, because a lot of people thought if we soak the almonds, it doesn't last long enough for the consumption. However, what if we dry it? We dry those soaked nuts. They would want to dry those soaked nuts at very low temperature to make sure that those enzymes are not killed, those nutrients are not ruined. So only 23% out of 85 recipes recommended temperatures, that is about 150 degrees Fahrenheit or 66 degrees Celsius and lower. So we didn't stop just at the content analysis, because we know that those popular recipes could be only representative to those content creators, what they share. So we didn't really know what would consumers actually do in their own home kitchen. So we later on conducted consumer surveys, understanding the consumers' knowledge, attitudes, and practices of nut soaking. And we sourced the consumer response from Qualtrics, and who manages marketing database. So we had over 900 consumers who either soak nuts or soaking nuts make nut-based dairy alternative products like nut milk or nut cheese or even nut yogurt. So as for the soaking condition, we saw very similar results from what I presented earlier in our content analysis. So in the content analysis, we saw that almost half recommended using raw nuts, right? But when we look at our consumer survey, we saw very similar results. So 43% felt that it was extremely important that raw tree nuts should be used when you soak. And also we found similar soaking temperature, which was relatively high. So more than half reported that they soak the nuts at or at a higher temperature than room temperature. And more than 1/3 claimed that they soaked more than 8 hours. And also, most of them did not specify the nut to water ratio. So from there, we wanted to know that we've already known, from the content analysis and the survey, generally, what do consumers do in their home kitchen when they soak the nuts? Now it's the time to take that part of information back to the lab, try to validate those conditions and see what are the food safety implications of those consumer behaviors. And now I'm going to switch gear and turn this back to Dr. Harris, and she will share more about the lab results.
All right. So let's see. So I believe you're seeing my slides, right? Yeah. So the question we had was, if pathogens are present in the nuts that people happen to be soaking, what is the outcome of that? And as I mentioned before, there are a number of things that you need for microbial growth, and in low moisture foods and dry foods like nuts, we've taken away the moisture. So we've taken away one of those important factors, and now we're adding it back in by generally covering up the nuts and allowing them to soak over time. So this is just an overview of generally the experiments that we have done. And this picture happens to have walnuts, but we've done these with other nuts, and other researchers have also in the meantime looked at a wide range of products. So just because I'm showing walnuts here, I might be showing a different nut on another slide, but the procedure is generally the same. So we wanted to ask two questions. We wanted to ask a question, what if the nuts came in contaminated? So we have procedures in the lab where we can actually take foodborne pathogens, Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli, O157H7 is what we used in this particular case. We inoculate the nuts and we dry them. And so there's a time period to let the pathogen kind of acclimatize on the nut. And then that mimics contamination of nuts before soaking. We also did another procedure where we, instead of inoculating the nut, we wanted to know, well, what happened if the pathogen arose from the kitchen itself? So maybe a utensil or hands or something that might not have arisen from the nut, but from the kitchen. So we inoculated the liquid rather than inoculating the nut. And I'll just cut that conversation short by saying it didn't matter. It didn't matter. The outcome was exactly the same, whether we inoculated the nut or if we inoculated the water. And so I'm only going to show you what happened when we inoculated. This is results for almonds. As I said, I was kind of mixing it up, and I'm only showing data for salmonella, but in general, the same data was, the same results happened with all the pathogens and with all the nuts that we've looked at. Now, we were looking at ambient temperature, room temperature, so 73 degrees Celsius. And really at ambient temperature of soaking, we went from 1,000 cells per sample, and these were 10-gram samples. So 1,000 cells per sample at 24 hours. In that sample, we had 7 million cells of salmonella, just to give you a perspective of what the difference between 0 hour and this blue bar here at 23 degrees Celsius or 73 degrees Fahrenheit. We wanted to ask the question, well, what if we knocked the temperature back just a little bit? How far would we have to go? How cold would we have to go where we didn't see a significant increase in 24 hours? And that was 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So, of course, colder than 59 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to get the same result because the colder the temperature, the slower the growth, and at refrigerated temperatures, proper refrigerated temperatures, salmonella won't grow at all. So obviously in the home kitchen, nobody's dialing or very few people have the ability to dial things down to 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's why overall you'll see as we move forward, refrigeration is what we are recommending because that's an easy temperature to achieve for most consumers. Now, this is a paper that was published by Professor Joy Wade-Cusick up in Oregon State. This was published just last year, and she did a wide range of grains, a wide range of nuts, and a number of seeds. And I've drawn these blue lines in here just to indicate that on average, all of these products behaved the same way when it came to salmonella at 72 for 24 hours. So very similar to what we did, but again, here a wide range of products, starting out with 1,000 cells, and after 24 hours, ending up with about 10 million cells. So very, again, I'm just showing averages overall of the products, but that's the take-home message. Significant growth can occur if the pathogen is there and you soak at ambient temperatures. So remember, if we go back to the original product and actually to what consumers are doing in the home, we also wanted to ask the question, well, if you're going to dry the product, would that have any impact at all on the outcome? And so again, here is just an example. We had inoculated walnuts, also done it with other products, soaked them for 24 hours, drained them, and then we didn't use an oven. We used a type of oven that's not a kitchen type oven, but a laboratory type oven to dry the nuts, and we set this to the 66 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature that people said that they were drying at home. and dried for 24 hours. And I can tell you that most of these nuts will be completely dry or back to their original moisture content in much shorter times than 24 hours, usually in 6 to 8 hours at those temperatures. But we went for the whole 24 hours and looked over time. So here again, this one is moisture. When you soak them, you get up to 40% moisture. And then you can see that after about 12 hours in this case, we were down back to about the original moisture content. And if you look at the population of Salmonella over time, this is per nut sample. Again, we started after soaking with about 1 million cells per sample. And at the end of 14 hours, we actually ended up with, you can see, not significant, but slightly higher numbers because we were basing it on a per sample basis. And there was a concentration effect because we had lost moisture in that product. So Salmonella in these products under these conditions can survive very well during drying. It is not a control step that a consumer could use at home. So take-home messages, I think, come in 2 buckets. One is avoid contamination, and that can be either by purchasing treated nuts and home sanitation. That means, you know, everything is clean in the environment that you're using for soaking, and you're paying attention to hygiene, hand washing, and things like that. And then you're preventing growth and multiplication by either refrigerating during soaking or doing a very short soak time. Or you're doing both 1 and 2. And obviously, if you're doing 1 and 2, you're including a hurdle concept, and you're building risk reduction plus risk reduction equals amplified risk reduction. But I just wanted to mention briefly before I turn it back to Professor Feng that purchasing treated nuts for the consumer is tricky. You know, a lot of these nuts are purchased in bulk. And so in bulk, you lose a lot of the label. It might say raw, but you're not able to look at the package. And I will tell you that it's probably not universal, but for many in the industry, there's not a legal definition. There's not an FDA definition of what raw is. And what it is used for in nuts is typically meaning it's not roasted. So it has a raw-like characteristic, an unroasted characteristic. And so I picked up a couple of packages just from Trader Joe's. There's no nothing special about Trader Joe's product, but it was easy and I wanted to use as a comparison. So in this particular case, they've put 2 asterisks on the front. So the front label says raw California walnut halves. And if you look on the back panel, you know, in a corner, you'll see these asterisks to say these walnuts have been steam treated. And this steam treated would significantly reduce any pathogens that might have been there. But if you look at the package that was right next door to it, you can see there's raw cashew pieces. There's no asterisk here. There's no statement on the back panel. And I'm not 100% sure, to be honest, whether that means that it wasn't steam treated or they just chose not to share that information because it's not required information to share. So I would just, I just wanted to point out that this is something that we can communicate to consumers, but sometimes you have to know what you're looking for if you're really looking for a product that has been treated for reducing pathogens. So I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Feng to talk about taking this information and crafting consumer food safety messages.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. So when it comes to developing an effective way to communicate to consumers can always be a little bit tricky. So as I know that most of this audience are extension educators or health educators, I think you may have even more like real life experience and seeing that when we communicate with our clientele, they may not even understand or they may not interested. So there are some strategies we could use to craft our communication with our audience, including we can think about the information that they care about. They would like to receive information or from the sources that they trust and deliver in the way that they prefer. So I think when we talk about like audience targeted communication, those 3 points can be quite helpful, but also can be challenging. So let's start from the first one, information that they care about. So in the past, we have been like trying to understand like what are the information can change the consumers the most around safe food handling. So we tried different statements and try to see like what are the statements would change them or they feel like they are most likely to change. So we crafted messages like, so certain practice could make them sick versus certain messages or certain practices could potentially lead them to die. So surprisingly, most people would think they would change if they hear something that this practice could make them sick instead of die. Because there are some like back thought within the consumers, they felt like if something make me die, it must be very low chance. And I would not be that. If it's 1 in 6, I would be the 5 of the 6, not the 1 in 6. And also similarly, when we conduct a study with pet owners and we ask them, so what were the like news headline make you worry more? So either like 140 pets got sick from this like this brand of pet food versus 140 people got sick from this like pet food. So significantly more pet owners would feel like they would react to the news headline related with pet who got sick. So we noticed that when we try to think about what to communicate with our target audience, we need to first ask ourselves, what are the things this audience group would care more about? Second, they would like to receive from sources that they trust. So based on the 2022 published IFIC Food and Health Survey, it shows that the trust sources of information on foods to eat or to avoid are coming mostly from those health professionals, people like you. So they trust dietitians for food advice. They trust other healthcare professionals like nurses, doctors, and then followed up by government agency, and then like the websites, and then other like fitness professionals. So we need to think about whether we can collaborate with more educators or sources that our audience really trust. Last but not least, as the delivery format evolving, especially after the pandemic, more and more of us recognize how powerful the internet can be, how powerful the social medias can be. We also need to think about the evolving population as like this kind of health crisis happens, how we evolve from paper-based or in-person delivery format only to online to social media. But also we need to think about the age group. Like what are some popular delivery format within certain age group, and whether people in this case who soak nut, how old are they? Who are they? Where do they usually receive information? So based on our survey, we noticed that most of those nut soaking consumers, they receive information on YouTube, on social media like Instagram, like Twitter, and then followed by that, you start to see like more traditional ways like cookbook and family and friends. So we know that probably we need to increase our internet presence when we want to communicate nut safety, when we communicate with this group of audience. So let's go back to what Dr. Harris's take-home message. So from avoid cross-contamination to prevent growth and to combination of both. So when we restructure, when we think about how to communicate this message to the consumers, we need to start ask ourselves, if we tell them that, hey, avoid contamination, do they even understand why is that? Like we said before, consumers generally do not associate raw tree nuts or other low moisture foods with food safety risk. So they would wonder why you tell me avoid contamination. So how can the message stand out? Every day, consumers are going through thousands of messages on the television, on the internet. So why would they care about what we tell them to prevent growth or avoid contamination? And last but not least, who should be my partner to deliver the message? It goes back to who do they trust and what delivery format they really prefer. So with that, I would like to thank you to participate in our webinar, and we want to thank the funding source, like the government agency, to partially support this study. And please follow us on our social media accounts. We do craft some information about nut soaking and nut milk making. So thank you. And now we can open up for questions.
Thank you.